Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where I talk about every single book on my shelves because this has been one of my favourite series for a very long time and it's about time it had a dedicated review. Today we are talking about Emily Tesh's Greenhollow Duology. Some quick disclaimers before we start. Both of these books were gifted to me by a friend or family member. Regardless of where books come from, nobody's paying me to talk about books and all opinions are my own. I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible while talking about both books in the duology. If you do want to go into this knowing absolutely nothing, pause the video, go read them, they're not that long, come back when you've read them, we'll chat then. And I will link the story graph for the books below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings. I would say content warning for book 1 of a past bad relationship, and I would suggest just looking that up if you're wanting to read these. This is a fantasy novella duology featuring Silver in the Wood, which is book 1, and The Drowned Country, which is book 2. They came out between 2019 and 2020. Am I right? Yes, I am. They are gaslamp fiction, I think, technically. They are also just fantasy books generally, and they are romances. I don't know if I would pin them as a romance meaning all of the things that usually means, but they do have a strong romantic plotline in them. Emily Tesh is an author who has most recently published the full-length novel Some Desperate Glory, which I am desperate to read. I'm desperate to get to it. I really want to. It's on my list for when I finish all the audiobooks I'm currently working on. You sit up there. It's probably going to fall down if I try and stand it upright properly. There is a wild man who lives in the deep quiet of Greenhollow, and he listens to the wood. Tobias, tethered to the forest, does not dwell on his past life, but he lives a perfectly unremarkable existence with his cottage, his cat, and his dryads. When Greenhollow Hall acquires a handsome, intensely curious new owner in Henry Silver, everything changes. Old secrets better left buried are dug up, and Tobias is forced to reckon with his troubled past, both the green magic of the woods and the dark things that rest in its heart. Spooky stuff. My biggest reason that I love this series to death is that I am an absolute sucker for the old man of the woods character trope, I guess. I really loved it most recently in Gods of the Weirdwood by R.J. Barker, but this is just a fantastic take on that. What I like about this is the way that we're introduced to Tobias as this almost woodland spirit character. It's never introduced as, hi, I'm Tobias and here are my magical powers. You infer it through the text in a way that I think is classic of a novella of this kind, and you just get it in little details about his life and where he lives and how he communicates with the forest, and I think it's really well handled for that particular character archetype of someone who has immense power but is also deeply practical, and I very much enjoy Tobias as a character. I think while we're talking about him, we may as well also talk about Henry Silver, who is that stereotypical young, inquisitive, wealthy individual who was brought to the nearby hall. I really like Henry. I think getting to know Henry better in book 2 definitely warmed me to him when I was then rereading the first book again. I should say, the two books do round off very nicely. They are distinct, separate books, but you definitely need to read book 1 before you read book 2, or book 2 won't make much sense. I feel I shouldn't need to tell you that, but I know myself, and I used to be the person who would just go, I'll read book 2. Don't. Read book 1 first. I've talked about both of the characters, let's talk about them together. This romance that really fills the pages of these books. I don't know how Emily Tesh managed to write what feels like a slow burn romance in the pages of a fairly short novella. I don't know how. Even if you combined the two of these, they wouldn't be a long book, and yet it's managed. I really like the dynamic between these two. I think it's a nice romance that kind of grows in a very organic way. That's not me intending to make a forest reference. It just happened that way. I think that for me, if it weren't a novella, I would feel like I didn't have enough information exchanged between the two of them. But because of the way that this story is framed, it definitely felt like I got to know both of them separately and got to know them together and felt like they had chemistry. It's a good gay romance, what can I say? Book 2 is quite different from book 1 based on kind of how book 1 ends. I would say book 1, kind of 80% of it is this build up to quite a big thing that happens that I don't want to spoil, and then book 2 blows that out even more. I personally like that. I didn't the first time that I read Drowned Country. The first time I picked up Drowned Country was in conjunction with Silver in the Wood, but I wasn't convinced by it because I wanted that slow, foresty kind of story again, and book 2 is much more fast-paced than that. However, on reflection, on a reread, I feel like Emily Tesh does something really special in book 2 and definitely builds out to feel more like a world rather than a story. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do in the second book of a novella duology. Maybe it was a choice to do that. Maybe we could have had another foresty story, but I liked being able to fill out elements of the world that I didn't see in book 1. I think because book 1 does have the elements towards the end, it definitely feels earned to branch out in book 2 in that way. Again, branched out, not a pun, unintentional. I do, however, think that overall book 1 is much stronger. I just think it's a little bit more narratively cohesive. It has more of a novella feel to it, where book 2 feels a bit more like a short story. I'm trying to think what the actual page difference is. Actually, book 2 is much longer. So there you go. I don't know whether it's just that book 1 is so nicely contained in a way that book 2 isn't, or it's just that I've read book 1 more times. Who's to say? For me personally, first book is stronger. I think the other thing to mention is that those broad things which I personally enjoyed do feel like they come a little bit out of nowhere in book 1. On a reread, you can kind of see the inklings of them being there, but definitely reading them back to back or reading them in the audiobook bind-up, which is how I read these, you definitely get the sense of you being kind of thrust into a more open world than you were potentially expecting. I would say it's sort of like, to use a video game analogy, thinking you're playing a game where it's very kind of railroaded levels and suddenly you're in an open world game and you're like, oh, this wasn't what I was anticipating. It's not bad, it's just not what I was expecting. I almost feel like I want another 5 books in this series just to continue going on adventures with these characters, because I think it would make book 1 feel like more of a prequel and the other books would feel like distinct adventures. Perhaps that's what I would like. I think the last thing to mention is what I mentioned with all books that kind of have that romantic core to them. If this isn't the kind of pairing you enjoy, you might not enjoy this. If a story where you also have to deal with a kind of separation and coming back together isn't your thing, this might not be for you either. I personally really enjoy it, having read it multiple times. I like seeing relationship things evolve every single time I read it. I take something away from it. That works for me, it may not work for you. Other things that you might want to read if you have read this, I already mentioned Gods of the Weirdwood by R.J. Barker. By the time this video goes up, I might have a review up for it if I've been organised. If not, I'm sorry I didn't get round to it, but that has very similar character archetype stuff going on, though that is a full-length novel and much more, even more fantasy. In terms of this kind of relationship dynamic and exploring healing from past trauma, if we're wanting to jet into science fiction, Winter's Orbit is a really, really good book that I would recommend you read anyway. I will link my review if I remember. I just really enjoyed it. And I wondered about Aliette de Bodard's House of Shattered Wings, which is the first of the Dominion of the Fallen series. I have a very old review up for that, but it's a really interesting series that has some similar pairings in terms of magical ability. And also, this is just a reminder for me that I should reread that series at some point. Should you read this? Absolutely yes. They were my favourite books of, I think, 2019, but I genuinely don't remember because I've not kept records back that far. I really love them. I think they're fantastically written. I'm so excited to read a full-length book from Emily Tesh. It's going to be a great time. I'm looking forward to it. I will say my recommendation is to do the audiobook. I think the audiobook narrator is really good, and you also get the 2 books bound up together, which I find more satisfying. However, I do love the cover for The Drowned Country, which I will put up on screen so you can see it properly, so I wanted to own them separately. Have you read these? Do you have plans to? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're down there commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also follow me on social media. Come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I would like to say an enormous, huge, squishy thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, live streams and more. If you'd like to join their number, that's linked in the description below as well. Thank you to you for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. There's gonna be some bloopers now. Emily Tesh is an author who has also most recently published the full-length novel.